The jungle was always alive, but not like this. Dr. Mara Hill watched, stomach churning, as the once serene symphony of the Amazon twisted into a cacophony of screams and unnatural howls echoing from beneath the dark canopy. The construction team had been digging through what was supposed to be a rich vein of undiscovered plant species. Instead, they unearthed a charnel pit, a mass grave wrapped in the roots of the ancient forest. Mara stood on the periphery of the dig site, the humid air thick with the stench of decay that the upturned earth had vomited up. Bones, human by the look of them, were tangled with the sinews of roots, as if the jungle itself had claimed the bodies long ago. "Fuck, look at this one," muttered Diego, one of the local workers, holding up what looked disturbingly like a child's skull. The eye sockets, empty and staring, seemed to bore into Mara as Diego tossed it back into the pit with a sickening crack. That night, under the facility's artificial lights that turned the surrounding jungle into a wall of impenetrable darkness, the pathogen began its resurrection symphony. First, it was the insects. Swarms of previously harmless beetles and ants began to cluster and crawl in patterns that defied natural instincts, assembling around the unearthed bones like worshippers at an altar. Then came the animals. Small mammals, dragged dead from the trap set by the biologists for study, began to convulse. Mara was called to the lab just in time to see a dead capuchin monkey, its body bloated and limbs contorted unnaturally, shudder back to life on the examination table. "What the actual fuck?" whispered Tim, the lead research assistant, as he backed away, knocking over a tray of surgical tools that clattered to the floor. The monkey's eyes snapped open, bloodshot and unseeing, and it let out a gurgling screech that was abruptly cut short as its jaws clamped down viciously on his arm. Chaos erupted. Shouts filled the air as the monkey, frenzied and impossibly strong, tore through the lab. It leapt onto Sarah, another researcher, her screams rising shrill as it ripped open her throat. Blood sprayed, painting the pristine lab equipment a stark, vivid crimson. Security arrived, guns drawn, and faces pale with fear. It took 5 bullets to put the creature down, each shot echoing like a death knell through the facility. But the damage was done. Tim and Sarah lay motionless on the blood-slicked floor, their wounds horrific and unmistakable. As Mara stood frozen, the facility's alarm blared into life, a wailing siren that heralded the containment breach. The pathogen was loose, and the nightmare had only just begun. The entire facility was locked down under emergency protocols, sealing in the living and the dead alike. Mara's mind raced as she looked at the fallen bodies of her colleagues, their blood pooling together in a grotesque tableau. The pathogen wasn't just reanimating the dead. It was learning, adapting, and it hungered for more than just the small creatures of the jungle. The screams hadn't stopped. They had only grown in number and despair. As Mara rallied with the remaining staff, the facility's PA system crackled to life. "Code Black," the emotionless voice announced. "This is not a drill. Secure all biohazard materials and proceed to the nearest safe zone immediately. Be advised, all exits are sealed until further notice." The dead were rising, driven by a force that science had yet to understand, in a place no one expected. And they were hungry. The corridors of the research facility, once sterile and silent, had transformed into claustrophobic tunnels of terror. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Mara Hill's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud echo in her ears as she navigated through the chaos. The initial outbreak had spread faster than any contagion Mara had studied before. The infected, her colleagues, friends, were no longer human. Their bodies had mutated, grotesque caricatures of their former selves with bulging, veined skin that seemed to pulse with a black ichor. Their eyes, devoid of any human emotion, glowed with a feral hunger. Mara, along with a small group of survivors, had barricaded themselves in Lab 3, one of the few areas not yet breached. The lab was a fortress for now, but outside, the screams and growls of the infected kept them company. A constant reminder of the nightmare just beyond the door. We can't stay here forever, Mara thought, her mind racing for a solution. We need to find a way out. But how? As she pondered their grim options, a sudden crash at the door jolted everyone to attention. The heavy metal door dented inward as something on the other side threw itself against it with incredible force. The survivors scrambled, grabbing anything that could be used as a weapon. Fire extinguishers, lab stands, even broken pieces of equipment became makeshift arms in their desperate hands. "Hold the fucking door!" shouted Dr. Javier Mendoza, a plant biologist who had never imagined his career in botany would lead to this. He braced against the door with his shoulder, his face set in grim determination. Mara moved to his side, helping to hold the door. The infected outside snarled and pounded, their strength seemingly superhuman. The door's steel frame began to warp under the assault. "We need another way out," Mara said, turning to the rest of the group. Her eyes landed on the ventilation shaft above them. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. The vents? Can anyone fit? Before anyone could answer, the door buckled violently, a bloody hand forcing its way through the widening gap. The hand was followed by a face, its features horribly disfigured, skin hanging off in tatters. It was Paula, the microbiologist, now a grotesque version of her former self. "Jesus Christ," whispered Alex, a young intern, his face pale with horror. Mara grabbed a scalpel from a nearby tray. With a grimace of determination and disgust, she plunged the blade into the reaching hand, severing tendons and bone. Paula's howl was otherworldly, filled with rage and pain, as she withdrew her mutilated limb. "We need to move now," Mara commanded. "Javier, Alex, help me with the grate." They worked frantically, unscrewing the vent cover as more dents formed on the door. Just as they pried it free, the door gave way with a screech of rending metal. Mara barely looked back as she climbed into the narrow vent. The sounds of her infected colleagues flooding into the room. Crawling through the tight claustrophobic ductwork, Mara led the way, the beam from her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Below them, the infected roared and raged, searching for their escape. After what felt like hours, they emerged into the main atrium. The scene was apocalyptic. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, some torn apart, others eerily intact as if asleep. The infected wandered aimlessly, their movements jerky and unnatural. Mara and her group stayed high, moving silently across the upper catwalks. Their goal was the communications room on the other side of the facility. If they could reach it, they could send a distress signal, call for help. But as they moved, a terrible realization dawned on Mara. The pathogen wasn't just reanimating the dead. It was evolving them. Some of the creatures below moved with purpose, their actions coordinated as if driven by a collective will. What have we unleashed? Mara thought, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. As they continued their perilous journey across the catwalks, each step was a silent prayer, each breath a hope against hope. The communications room was in sight, a beacon of faint hope amidst the relentless darkness that had swallowed the facility. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. Mara Hill's legs burned with exertion as she led the survivors across the last stretch of the catwalk, their every step echoing ominously in the vast, empty atrium below. Below them the infected roamed, with grotesque, lumbering gaits. Their numbers had grown, and among the shambling horde, Mara could see newer forms, faster, smarter, and far more dangerous. The pathogen had not only resurrected the dead, but had begun a macabre evolution, creating monstrosities that defied the natural order. "Almost there," Mara whispered, her voice strained with fatigue and fear. The small group had been reduced to just 4, including herself. Javier, Alex, and a security officer named Rita were the only ones who had made it this far. They moved with grim determination, each aware that the slightest noise could attract unwanted attention. They reached the communications room, and Mara quickly punched in the security code. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room filled with high-tech equipment that now seemed almost alien in the hellish context of their situation. "Quickly, get inside," Mara urged, as they slipped into the room, sealing the door behind them. She moved to the main console, her fingers flying over the keys as she accessed the satellite uplink. "Lucas Moore," she muttered under her breath, entering the coordinates for the emergency broadcast. Lucas was an old friend of hers, a monster hunter, and he was perhaps their last hope. If anyone would understand the catastrophic potential of what they'd unleashed, it was him. Outside, the growls and moans of the infected grew louder, more insistent. They had sensed their prey. Mara's heart raced as she typed out the message, her hands trembling. "An isolated research facility in the Amazon. The dead are rising. We need you." Just as she hit send, a tremendous crash echoed through the room. The door buckled inward, the reinforced glass spiderwebbing under the force of the bodies thrown against it. "Hold them back," Mara screamed, as Rita and Javier rushed to barricade the door with a heavy cabinet. Alex stood by Mara, watching the screen to confirm the message had gone through. "It's sent," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mara turned to look at her team, her eyes meeting each of theirs. There was a silent acknowledgement between them, a shared understanding that they might not make it out alive. But the message was sent. The world was warned. The door gave way with a final, deafening crash. Infected bodies poured into the room, their faces twisted in horrific parodies of their former selves. Mara grabbed a scalpel, her last line of defense, as she and her team fought back with desperate ferocity. But there were too many. One by one, Mara watched her team fall. Javier was the first to go down, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Rita fought bravely but was soon overtaken. Alex stayed by Mara's side until the end, fighting back to back. Then a sharp, agonizing pain shot through Mara's body as she felt teeth sink into her flesh. Her scream was drowned out by the cacophony of the infected. As she fell, her eyes caught sight of the screen, confirmation that her message had been delivered. With her last ounce of strength, Mara Hill focused on that small victory. The world knew. Lucas knew. It was up to him now. The screen blurred before her eyes as she was torn apart. Her last thought, a fleeting hope that her death would not be in vain. The facility faded into darkness, the echoes of the unspeakable horrors continuing to resonate in the Amazonian night.